name's Hamish Hansford and I'm from the Cyber and Infrastructure Security Centre in Home Affairs. It's great to be here at the 15th Cyber Security Summit and really great to be talking about cyber security generally because 2022 has seen quite a significant change in the threat landscape, starting the year with the Russian invasion into Ukraine and then the use of cyber as a weapon within that conflict. And then thinking about Australia with the Australian Cyber Security Centre having one cyber incident reported now every 7 minutes. And over the last couple of months, we've had quite a few high-profile cyber incidents. So today's conference is really about how do we think about the future and how do we start to prepare Australia for a much better environment in terms of security outcomes with cyber security at the heart of it. Today I wanted to talk to you about what we're doing in the Australian government to really provide the framework for an ultimate goal within the next 5 years to make Australia the safest and most secure set of infrastructure in the world. As an aspirational goal, that's something that we're particularly committed to, and we're particularly focused on government's role in setting that relationship with particularly you and the audience here today, but also more generally with industry and for those who aren't in the room. When you think about critical infrastructure and its importance, I really set you a challenge today. And the challenge is really around think about everything that you did in order to come to the conference. And when you think about it at a personal level, the electricity you relied on, the gas, water that you might have used, heated by gas rather, water, food, transport, finance and banking, communications. And at a personal level, critical infrastructure really makes your life function. Then when I think about my job really looking at critical infrastructure at the national level, you lift up that personal experience and you think about what would happen if any one of those pieces of critical infrastructure stopped working. And in an acute sense, what would happen if a hospital, for example, didn't have an ICU that functioned? What would happen if we lost our electricity grid for a period of time? And you slowly come to the conclusion that at a national level, the importance of infrastructure in our day-to-day life really does underpin our prosperity as a nation and equally underpins our national security. So in order to protect infrastructure, we need to first understand it at a very granular level. And now with the reforms that were put through the Parliament both in 2018 and then again in 2021 and 22 through 2 sets of legislative reform, we now have a legislative definition of precisely what we mean by critical infrastructure in Australia. 11 different sectors, 22 different types of critical infrastructure assets, and even some privately declared critical infrastructure assets. Really, when you look at them at a granular level, our role at the national level is to look at all of the infrastructure together and really understand how it connects, what are the national risks, what are the areas of aggregate risk, and how do we start as a nation to put in place the preventative and responsive mechanisms to be able to respond to some of the security challenges that we face as a country. When you think that through, the Department of Home Affairs and the centre that I run maintains a register of all critical infrastructure assets in Australia and really looks at that from 2 different perspectives. The first is who owns and operates critical infrastructure, and then physically where is it located. And our view is that as the National Coordinator of Critical Infrastructure Protection, when you look at a national level, you start to see some levels of risk and some levels of particular impact that if there was for example, a successful cyber incident, that might then have cascading impacts across the Australian economy. And so by taking a national view, we're taking a view about national risk and we're looking at how we can mitigate it. We're also getting an understanding of the successful cyber incidents that have occurred across the Australian economy, with mandatory cyber incident reporting now a requirement for the majority of critical infrastructure. This is building up a really granular understanding of the techniques and tactics that adversaries use to target infrastructure and to really start to build out and learn from some of those attacks and try and prevent them in the future. Which then leads on to the major piece of work that we're working on at the moment. We've just consulted on the application of a risk management program for critical infrastructure in Australia. At its core, this is setting a baseline for security standards in the economy, in the critical infrastructure economy, starting to paint out what does Australia really want to have as its baseline set of security standards. And so within 18 months, infrastructure will be required to meet maturity level 1 of the Essential 8 or a similar framework, which is outlined in the Risk Management Program rules, really lifting the cyber regime and our cyber security to at least a minimum standard. But we certainly encourage, particularly for those larger players, to meet a high level standard in accordance with some of the guidelines out there, for example, from 𝐒𝐲𝐝𝐻, or those entities that are prudentially regulated across Australia. Equally though, cyber can't stand alone. We're looking at personnel security risks, really starting to understand who has the ability to critically impact the functioning of infrastructure, looking at physical security risks, including from the increasing number of natural hazards we're seeing across the Australian economy. And then finally, and perhaps more challenging, is looking at supply chain risks. Increasingly, supply chains, as we've found out throughout the last couple of years, have become fragile and actually can have a fundamental impact on the functioning of infrastructure. So by looking at these preventative risks and working out how, as far as practical, they can be mitigated, that's really the core of risk management and sets in place Australia for a pretty significant step change in our regime. But of course, if things go wrong, and they may well, there might be a cyber incident that the government really wants us to have confidence that we have all the powers in place to be able to enable an effective response. And now at law, and we're practicing it time and time again with state and territory jurisdictions, with individual companies across Australia, how do we respond to a significant cyber incident, the like of which Australia hasn't had to date? What are the mechanisms that we need to work on? How do we start to build familiar contacts in industry, between industry and government? How do we start to build out our ability for the government to really assist? And really looking at that, we say that there is a strong role for the government and industry to try and get infrastructure back up and working. If we're under a sustained cyber attack or a set of cyber incidents that couldn't be responded to, that is fundamentally impactful on our economy and the way of life of many Australians, really going back to the point that I started this presentation at. So we're preparing for the worst, hoping for the best. And finally, we've come up with an idea about the systems which are truly integral to the functioning of society, and defined at law now a term called systems of national significance. The Minister for Home Affairs has now declared 82 systems of national significance, and we're working with that smaller group of systems of national significance to make sure there are incident response plans in place, that we're exercising those plans, looking for vulnerabilities when the threat environment dictates it, and looking for systems information exchange when that is needed. And so together, we're working on a set of reforms with industry, but really it's a starting point. It's a framework to now allow further collaboration. And we're really keen to talk to summits like this and conferences across Australia to build that collaborative relationship with industry. And if I'm going to leave you with one key message today is, although I come from a regulator, actually I've got a broader role which is about critical infrastructure protection coordination. That's the key term in the administrative arrangement order that the Minister for Home Affairs and Minister for CYBERSECURITY is really charged with implementing in Australia, a guiding set of principles for us to look at, particularly over the next 5 years as we plan out where the threats will change and where our focus really needs to be. And we're here to collaborate with industry and here to collaborate with other governments across Australia, and that's our enduring challenge. For the last 20 odd years, we've run a trusted information sharing network, and in 2023 you'll see a reinvigorated trusted information sharing network with sector level work, but increasingly cross-sectoral work as we look at those risks that I spoke about across the nation. How do we start to prepare ourselves collectively for those, both in a sense, in a preventative sense, but then preparing for a potential time when we need to act more reactively. So I hope today's summit really gets into some of the granular details around cybersecurity, a good sense about some of the challenges that we can collectively work on, and certainly from my perspective, you've got our commitment to work collaboratively into the future as we think about how we chart that course together, and I really thank you for the time today, and hope that this conference really does start to think about some of the issues that we need to challenge ourselves with confronting in the years ahead. Thank you.